Totalitarianism is one of the most important concepts in our political language. It means a dictatorship, but not just any dictatorship. Only those dictatorships that seek to impose their presence in all aspects of a people's lives. It is a term that in the language of us historians primarily indicates the two worst dictatorships that Europe experienced in the 20th century, Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union of Stalin. The countries of concentration camps, secret police, arbitrary arrests, and secret death sentences. If we look at how and when the term totalitarianism was born and began to be used in European politics, there is a surprise for us Italians. This word was not coined to talk about Hitler or Stalin. It was coined to talk about Mussolini. The first to use it, probably in the aftermath of the March on Rome, is Giovanni Amendola, an anti-fascist journalist and politician who would soon be killed by the fascists. Amendola is the first to say that the fascists want to seize power and leave no form of opposition alive. He calls this totalitarianism. It is still a use that I wouldn't say is naive, but rather a simple one of the term. And in this same sense, the main anti-fascist leaders use it during the few years in which Mussolini still allows a semblance of opposition in Italy. Don Luigi Sturzo, the founder of Christian democracy, uses it. Lelio Basso, a socialist, uses it too. Everyone says fascism is totalitarian and means it wants to take all the power and leave no space for others. But the extraordinary thing is that at a certain point, fascism accepts this definition. It is a definition, as you have seen, that was coined by opponents, which had a negative connotation, but at a certain point, Mussolini accepted to take it on. In 1925, on the eve of the Matteotti murder, at the same moment he accepts to say, "I am responsible for the Matteotti murder," and effectively ends democracy in Italy with the fascist laws, Mussolini also accepts to state that the goal of fascism is precisely that, to build a totalitarian state. In fascist ideology, totalitarianism means that the state dominated by the fascist party in Italy must be everything, and that there should be nothing outside of the state. Giovanni Gentile, the greatest philosopher to have adhered to fascism, will say that when he has to write the entry on the doctrine of fascism for the Italian encyclopedia, Treccani, Gentile states that for the fascist, everything is in the state, and outside the state, there is nothing, especially nothing worth having. And in this sense, Gentile says, fascism is totalitarian. In the experience of Italians, totalitarianism means something more banal, the oppression of the fascist party that is present everywhere and from which one cannot escape, that regimented everyone and put everyone in black shirts. But if you see the language spoken in Italy during the 20 years of fascism, you feel confused. Why do we today take it for granted that totalitarianism is a bad word, while, for example, democracy is a positive word? If one reads the Italian newspapers of that time, it is not like that. It is the complete opposite. In August of '39, when the Second World War was about to break out, Hitler suddenly surprised the world by allying with his worst enemy, Stalin, through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This, of course, caused enormous surprise and dismay around the world. During those days, the Italian newspapers rejoiced, stating that democratic countries are in trouble and anti-totalitarian countries are bewildered. For those reading the Italian newspapers, this means that we, who are totalitarian, are indeed the future. Democracy is an old thing from the past. Being democratic means being weak. The curious thing is that while the term totalitarianism was invented to talk about fascism, and then fascism itself aimed at building a totalitarian regime, today historians are actually not so much in agreement that Mussolini truly succeeded in constructing totalitarianism. They think so. They point out that in any case, Mussolini's dictatorship is something new in history, as there have been many authoritarian regimes in the past that did not allow freedom and did not permit opposition. Mussolini's regime is the first that does not want to exclude the masses from participation. They want to forcefully make them participate, regimented, compelled to march, forced to attend meetings and mass gatherings, but the masses must be dominated in a totalitarian manner by the fascist state. In this sense, some historians say, yes, Mussolini's regime is totalitarian. Others point out that it is Italy itself, due to its complexity, that cannot be reduced to a totalitarian regime. Let's think about what Italy was like under Mussolini, where the monarchy still existed, for example. Mussolini, an old republican who detests the king and the Savoy, was never able to free himself from them, and thus, throughout the 20 years, the dictatorship of the Duce coexisted with the monarchy, the role of the king, the royal family, and the court. They do not have great concrete power, but they exist and are very visible. This already indicates that fascism is not truly totalitarian. And then there is the Church. The Church, which is a huge international organization, but has its center, the Catholic Church, in Italy, in Rome. The Catholic Church, through the Lateran Pacts and the Concordat of 1929, agrees to bless the fascist regime. Perhaps Mussolini's greatest political success, however, it is clear that the Church intends to use the regime. It feels superior to objectives that go well beyond supporting the fascist regime, and the regime must nonetheless contend with the Church. And then in Italy, there is the large industry, the great families of industrialists like Pirelli, who are so powerful that they are not even forced to be fascists. Certainly they collaborate with fascism, but in a certain sense from the outside, and fascism must negotiate with them. In this sense, it seems more logical to reserve the category of totalitarianism for regimes that are much more efficient than Mussolini's. The first to speak of totalitarianism in relation to Stalin's Soviet Union is Trotsky. In 1936, in his book The Betrayed Revolution, Trotsky, a key figure of the October Revolution, later defeated by Stalin in the struggle for power and forced into exile, would be assassinated, a few years later by Stalin's assassins. Here, Trotsky writes this book, The Betrayed Revolution, in 1936, in which he denounces Stalin's Soviet Union, stating that it is not what we wanted to do, it is not what we communists wanted, says Trotsky. It rather resembles Mussolini's dictatorship. Trotsky evidently does not know fascist Italy very well. He has not considered whether it is truly a totalitarian country or not, but what interests him is denouncing Stalin's Soviet Union as the worst example of totalitarianism. And then after the Second World War, when the Nazi regime has disappeared but remains in everyone's memory, and instead the Soviet Union is there, Stalin is there, we are in the midst of the Cold War, and a fundamental book is published, which is Hannah Arendt's book, a German philosopher, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And it is precisely Hannah Arendt who first says, to leave Italian fascism out, it is another thing. The two totalitarianisms are the Soviet one and the Nazi one. Indeed, it is easy to show that these two countries have many things in common: concentration camps, secret police, arbitrary arrests, and terror. It is curious that, ideologically speaking, the Nazis did not actually identify with the totalitarian idea as Mussolini had done. The Nazis always presented themselves primarily as the great enemies of communism and preferred that it was Stalin's communism that bore, so to speak, the totalitarian brand. If one reads Hitler's intentions in his Mein Kampf, Hitler there presents himself as the great enemy of communism and therefore the defender of Western individualism. And when Nazi Germany is at war with the Soviet Union, Dr. Goebbels, the head of Nazi propaganda, will say, "We will win because we represent the West, Europe, humanistic values, the values of the individual, while Stalin's communists have built a system in which the individual no longer exists, in which man no longer exists, in which man is reduced to a machine." This is propaganda, of course. Those who analyze the actual functioning of the Nazi regime see all aspects of totalitarianism, starting from the fact that in Nazi Germany, right after Hitler came to power, there can be no organization, no association that has not aligned itself, as they say, that has not become Nazi. There cannot even be Boy Scouts. There can only be Nazi Boy Scouts. Here, having said all this, A reflection on our use of the concept of totalitarianism should not stop here at the similarities between Stalin's Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. It is a risk that is taken too often. Indeed, partly because here in the West, the Soviet Union has always been considered an enemy to be defeated, and therefore, it was convenient for everyone to emphasize the similarity that existed at the time of Stalin with Hitler's Germany. Here, partly for this reason, and partly due to mental laziness, we too often behave as if, once we have established that both Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union are totalitarian countries, we have said it all, as if we had demonstrated that they are the same thing and that the rest of the world is different, as if the world of the 20th century had been divided into two such distinct camps. And this is a mistake. It means no longer understanding, no longer remembering what that world was like. Because it is very true that the Soviet Union under Stalin resembled Nazi Germany, they had very similar concentration camps before the Nazis also added gas chambers, which the Soviets never included. But other aspects are surprisingly different. Hitler's Germany was a country founded on a racial conception, on the idea of the chosen people, the Germans, and the other inferior peoples, including us Italians, of course, and then the subhumans to be eliminated, the Jews, the Gypsies. Here, in the Soviet Union, there was nothing of the sort. And if one goes to look for a country that had a very precise and official racial policy in the 1930s, to our great surprise, we discover that the United States, the largest democracy in the world at that time, was an officially racist country, where there was a racial policy, where the population was counted by race. This is still the case, by the way. But where, especially in part of the Union, black people were concretely discriminated against, had no political rights, and were not allowed to sit on the bus in the seats reserved for whites. Do we want to say that the United States resembled the Soviet Union or resembled Nazi Germany? Well, yes, it resembled Nazi Germany if we are talking about racial politics, although it was in no way a totalitarian country. And if we look at the eugenic policies that Hitler's Germany implemented, with the idea that the human species could be improved by eliminating inferior beings, and especially by preventing the genetically impaired from procreating, these ideas were indeed expressed in the more civilized countries of Europe at the time. They were said and attempted to be put into practice in the countries of Scandinavia, for example. This does not mean that one can create rankings and say, but in the end, Stalin was less frightening than Hitler. That is not the point. The point is to be clear that when we use this fascinating and convenient category, totalitarianism, we must not believe that it is enough to explain everything.